Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us in our Eastside Bible reading for the week of May 10th through the 16th, 2020. As we continue in the book of 1 Samuel, we find where David again had the opportunity to do away with King Saul, and again he spares Saul's life. In 1 Samuel 26, 9 through 11, we see the respect that David had for the office of king, in spite of the fact that it was occupied by a king who was in a relentless pursuit of David's life. Read those verses. See how much respect God has, or rather David has, for God's choice of king, and also how David believed that God himself would take care of Saul. Upon finding out how close he came to death, Saul seems to relent somewhat, but David isn't quite so sure. He thinks that eventually Saul is going to do him in. And indeed, in spite of what Saul says, we see that he still seems intent on his pursuit of David. David, for his part, in what seems to be a very low spiritual point in his life, he aligns himself with the Philistines, who think that he's converted over to their side. Saul, for his part, seeks out a medium. He wants some message from beyond the grave, and he actually seems to get one from the departed Samuel. But the message centers on Saul's sure demise, as well as Israel's defeat at the hand of the Philistines. Well, eventually the prophecy proves true. Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle against the Philistines. And when David gets the news, instead of exulting at the fact that his enemy is dead, he kills the messenger for the messenger's seeming lack of respect for Saul. We find that David, though he was crowned king over Judah, has to tread carefully in order to unite the entire nation. And part of that is how he's going to deal with Saul's remaining family. Well, eventually, David is crowned king over all Israel. And that actually sparks another fight between Israel and the Philistines. But this time, the Philistines are routed. This time, Israel wins in a decisive fashion. And it enters a new era with David as king. When we go to the New Testament, we read as we continue Paul's second evangelistic trip in the book of Acts. We go with him to Corinth and then back home to Antioch to finish up that second trip. And then sometime later, we're not sure how much time elapses, but sometime later, Paul decides to leave again for another trip. And among other places, he spends some time in Ephesus. And during that time in Ephesus, exorcisms are performed, occultic books are burned, and Acts 19 verse 20 tells us that the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Well, in the meantime, Paul is in a hurry to get back to Jerusalem. And as he's heading back, he bypasses Ephesus on his return trip, and in Miletus, he calls to himself the elders of the Ephesian church, and he stresses to them his steadfastness in proclaiming to them the entirety of God's will, and also stresses to them their responsibility to keep it as elders of the church. Paul, on his way back to Jerusalem, was warned about the hostile reception that he would receive in Jerusalem, so much that there would be those who would bound him and try to take his life. But Paul would not be dissuaded. Well, upon his entry into Jerusalem, those hostile Jews trump up charges against him and set in motion by their relentless opposition to him events that would eventually take Paul to Rome. Now, Paul wanted to go to Rome, but I don't think he had any idea of the circumstances in which he would eventually arrive there. Our reading in the Psalms cover a lot of territory. In Psalm 96, It's a call to worship, and it begins this way: sing to Yahweh a new song. Sing to Yahweh, all the earth. Maybe it's a wonderful reminder to us of the place that singing has in our worship to God. Psalm 106 extols God's might while asking God for mercy, for salvation, for deliverance on the nation of Israel, even while the psalmist goes through all the sinful track record that Israel had concerning God. He goes through their ups and downs in the wilderness and their failings in the promised land, and finally ends with just a plea to God to be merciful to them, to save them. Psalm 122 is another one of those songs of ascent, which perhaps were sung as the assembly was making its way up the temple hill to worship. This is how it begins. It's probably familiar to you. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." I hope it's still that way for us as we make our way to worship God. Well, thanks for being with us this week in our Eastside Bible reading, and we'll catch you next time. God bless you.